Okay, we are going to do our introduction and overview of the various types of plants on planet Earth. This is going to take us from their ancestors, the green algae, from which they came, through all the evolutionary steps or the main evolutionary steps that lead to the modern plants that are around us today. Okay. We'll start off with looking at just a basic introduction, and then we'll go from there. Okay. General characteristics of plants. What makes a plant a plant? Okay. All plants are multicellular. All are photosynthetic. There is a particular type of chlorophyll that is important in plant photosynthesis, and all plants share it in common, chlorophyll A. All plants have cellulose cell walls. That is another thing they all share in common. And perhaps most importantly, they all possess adaptations to land. Okay, this is really distinctive, and what really separates algae, or some algae, from plants. Okay, now it is pretty much accepted among biologists who study this area that green algae are the ancestors of all plants that we see on Earth today. This is phylum Chlorophyta, if you'll remember from Protista. So we are talking about a protist phylum that is thought to have given rise to all plants that we have today. There are lots of things that link algae to plants, and we'll share those with you in a minute. But first, I really hope that you will take a moment to think about what life would have been like in a time without plants, because such a time did exist. There once were no plants on planet Earth, and it's hard for us to even imagine such a thing because we are so enveloped by plants when we step out our front door, at least here where we live. The land a billion years ago would have been pretty barren. There would have been green algae, there would have been life in the water, but land life would have looked very much like this. A lot of rock and not much else. A half a billion years ago, this is about 500 million years ago, we have the first evidence that appears in the fossil record of things that we truly could have called plants and not algae. So the links between these algae and these plant descendants that we have are several. Green algae and plants both have cellulose. They share the same type of chlorophyll. They both store food in the form of starch. And there are several other aspects of plants and green algae that convey similarity and common origin. But what is most important for us to focus on now is not so much the links between them, but the transition that was made from water to land. Water to land. I want you to make sure you get that in your little heads as we're going through this, that this is a major, major, major transition, and we see it in the animals as well. How do we get organisms that are adapted for life in water able to survive a much harsher reality on land? And when I say harsher, I mean, I guess it's all relative, but if you are a water living organism, first of all, your tissues are not protected against losing water because that has not been a concern. Natural selection wouldn't have favored an adaptation that prevented you from losing water because there was no need to, because you're bathed in water all the time. So to get onto land, water loss to the air, evaporation, because you're not constantly bathed in water, is a huge concern. Also, how do you get nutrients? Algae are being bathed in nutrient-rich water, and they absorb these nutrients, minerals, things like that through their tissues from the water. You can't absorb that kind of stuff through the air. It just doesn't work. How are you going to get nutrients? Distribution of gametes, of sex cells. in algae that live in the water, with many things that live in the water, the solution to reproduction is simply female squirts eggs, male squirts sperm in the water, they meet up, and good luck, see you later. But on land, if you just squirt your eggs and sperm, they're just going to land somewhere and dry out. That's not going to work. We've got to somehow have a way to get sperm to egg that is not dependent on water as the vehicle to do that. So additionally, not only can they not be transported, but if we are developing sperm and egg, these are highly, like many cells are delicate cells. We have to have some way to protect them from drying out. So distribution of gametes and sexual reproduction is a huge problem. So how did these first land plants that were able to get away from the water and not be bathed in it all the time, how did they solve these problems? Okay. They developed strategies to prevent water loss. Okay, they developed something called a cuticle, and we see these on all plant leaves and structures today. It's a waxy covering. That waxy covering keeps the water in the plant and prevents it from evaporating. But if we cover our entire plant in wax, then it can't get in things it needs, like all plants require CO2, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, or else they can't do photosynthesis. So that's a huge problem. So the first land plants also had stomata, holes in this waxy covering cuticle that allowed for some gases to get in, so they could still do photosynthesis. Now, another strategy that the first land plants arrived at was some way to get water and nutrients, the minerals from soil. The problem on land is not that you can't get minerals. The land is rich in minerals. If nothing else, this soil is chock full of them. In fact, the water is getting its nutrients and minerals from runoff from the land. But the problem for an algae would be how to get at those minerals without, it just doesn't work very well if you're mechanism to get bathed in them. So plants evolved roots, or at least root-like structures, and let's be clear that not all plants have roots. Some just have root-like structures, as we'll see in the moss in a minute. But either way, the roots or root-like structures do serve to connect the plant to the soil so it can get water and minerals from the soil. Also, solution to the gamete problem was to protect those gametes inside cells is probably not the best word, and reproductive structures, that's probably a better word, and fix it so they don't have to swim. We're going to get them blown in the air or carried through the air somehow. We're not going to rely on swimming sperm anymore. Additionally, we're going to get a new reproductive structure called a spore, which is going to be at least slightly protected. A protected spore that is going to allow for reproduction and distribution as well. So we'll talk more about that. So plant sperm can be transported through the air, and so on. We'll get more on that later. Okay. Now, here is beginning our journey. We are going to see kind of when all of these problems were solved. They were not all solved at once. It wasn't one big boom. It was first we solve this problem, and then we solve another problem, and we get another evolutionary branch, and then we solve another problem, and then we get another evolutionary burst of activity and more organisms. So we're going to go from the earliest plant species to the most modern and look at the evolutionary steps it took to get there. Now, our first step from the green algae is with moss-like non-vascular plants. Okay, let me be clear about what we're talking about. Non-vascular means that we lack something called vascular tissue. You have vascular tissue too. I want you to think of vascular tissue as plumbing. In other words, pipes that are going to very efficiently allow large amounts of food and water to flow through a plant very efficiently. So efficient movement of food and water in a plant. That's what vascular tissue allows for. Well, obviously these very first plants that we're talking about, they didn't have any. And since they didn't have any, that means they were relying on osmosis and diffusion to move materials. Now, if you'll recall, osmosis, movement of water from an area of high to low concentration, diffusion, movement of some solute from high to low concentration, is a cellular process, movement through a cell membrane. And if you're talking about that, you're talking about movements just from cell to cell to cell, extremely slow, not the most efficient means of transport. And so if you're going to rely on that, you're going to have to be a teeny tiny little plant, and that is what brings us to the moss. Okay, let me sorry. Alright, so there we go. Okay, so these plants were the first to colonize the land, and their advances over algae include that they do have a cuticle that is going to prevent water loss, and stomata, the holes that allow gas exchange. Another advance that I will mention that's not on here is that they have something called spores. Spores are not sex cells, not gametes, not sperm and egg, but we'll talk about how important they are in just a moment. They have no vascular tissue, which means they are relying on diffusion for transport and osmosis, and it's not efficient, and that limits, this is going to limit us in terms of size, okay? And they also have swimming sperm, which means moss are going to have to remain close to water if they're going to reproduce. This is usually why we don't see moss out in an open field, because it's not going to be moist enough for them to reproduce. We need mist from a creek or dew that's not readily evaporated, that kind of thing. Now you're looking at some moss. We will or have, depending on when you're viewing this, viewed some moss in class. Let us walk through the moss life cycle real quick, and then we'll stop and take a break. We're going to call this plant life cycles are really important in understanding some of their evolutionary trends. So this is we're going to refer to as alternation of generations. Okay, the life cycles found in plants. All plants, even though in some plants it's not really obvious to us that this occurs, but all plants alternate between two body forms. Okay, two body forms. And we're going to learn the mosses in detail. Okay, so we'll take a break and learn the mosses.